keep your Bibles back open to Luke. Appreciate Ken reading from that book a little earlier. We're going to be back there, Luke chapter 16, so go ahead and flip over to that. We're reading a little bit on the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which is my favorite parable of all of them. I don't know if you're allowed to have favorites, but I do, and this one is mine. So I'm seizing the opportunity to look at it and study it together. It's been an interesting week for me in putting this lesson together. While you're doing that, allow me a brief moment, not just to say thank you to Jeff and Zach for filling in for me last week. I mentioned that during the Bible class period about how much I appreciate men like that that can step in and can take care of things kind of at a moment's notice, give or take a few weeks. But I also want to thank people like Nathan, who put together the song service for last week. He was the one that found all the songs, put them in the PowerPoint. He's the one that put them along. Jeff for not only doing the class last week, but also kind of helping get everyone arranged beforehand. People like Joe for doing the video. People like Jason for cleaning the building every week. A whole bunch of people here that are members here that we sometimes don't really think about. We know all this stuff gets done. We talk about how it does get done. We don't ever consider how it gets done. So I appreciate those men and women that work behind the scenes to take care of the various things that keep our congregation running on a day-to-day basis, especially the elders and deacons, but especially the other people that also take care of those things. So I appreciate that. Luke chapter 16, let's go ahead and start in verse 19. We'll read the parable in its entirety before we make some comments. Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 19. It says, "Now there was a rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every single day. And a poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, and longed to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. And besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores." Verse 22, "Now the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. He cried out and said, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus so that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. But now he is being comforted here, and you are now in agony. Besides all of this, between us and you there is a great chasm fixed, so that those who wish to cross over from there to us will not be able to, and those who want to cross from there to us will not be able to.' Verse 27, he said, 'Then I beg you, Father, that you may send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment.' Abraham said, 'They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them.' But he said," verse 30, "No, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, that's when they're going to repent." Verse 31, he said to them, "If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they are not going to be persuaded, even if someone rises to them from the dead." I would probably argue that most of us, it's not the first time we've read the rich man and Lazarus. We probably are familiar with the story, at least on some type of level, whether we read it for its description of the afterlife, whether we read it to the description of hospitality and kind of charity work, or whatever the situation is, most of us have read this parable on some level. But to break it down, what essentially you have is you have 2 people who are diametrically opposed. These people could not be more opposite if they tried. You have the rich man who was on one section, who was living in splendor every day, joyously living in splendor, I might add. Somebody who was, if they were making movies about rich life or rich people's life, he would be one of those that's in there. Joyously living in splendor every day. He has purple, he has fine linen, not just describing the color of the clothes, but the type of fabric that's there as well. That, by the way, describes not just the outer clothes, but the inner clothes as well. So this is somebody who is very, very comfortable being comfortable, if that makes any sense. It's somebody who fares sumptuously, which I don't know about you, but every time I think of that phrase, fared sumptuously, I always think of that scene from Aladdin where people are just kind of dining and apples and pears and stuff are kind of falling off the table. Somebody who has food galore. Somebody who has no want for any kind of thing in his life. It also mentions very specifically, this flies under the radar, is somebody who has a gate on his property. Somebody who has a gate not just for protection, but also to keep people like Lazarus firmly out of it. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have Lazarus. Somebody who is a beggar, who has literally nothing in this world. And that word beggar literally means somebody who does not have anything. He is the lowest of the food chain. He is the lowest person that you can try to think of. Not physically, or not spiritually or socially necessarily, but physically you cannot get worse off in this world than somebody like Lazarus. It mentions that he's laid at the gate. Not even that he has to walk up and kind of knock on the gate, but he is laid at the gate physically because he can't even move. It's somebody who is starving, who doesn't have any food whatsoever, and it's also somebody who has sores all over his body. We looked up for quite a while this week to figure out whether the dogs licking his sores was a good thing or whether it was a bad thing. People are kind of on both ends of that. Some people will say, well, the dogs licking his sores was somebody, means that even the dogs had pity on him and they were trying to comfort him a little bit. Other people said, well, the dogs licking his sores are just making everything worse. Because when you have sores all over your body and dogs come up and lick it, that grating of that tongue gets your sores, it just hurts. But you can't do anything about it. But regardless of how you slice this situation, Luke the 16th chapter, you have two people who cannot be more polar opposite if they tried. And that's the idea that I believe Jesus is going after here. You have somebody on one end of the socioeconomic scale who has every single thing that they could want. You have somebody on the other side of the scale that does not have anything. And I love the way that Jesus embellishes the good or embellishes the fame on the one side and embellishes the poverty on the other side. But then you have them meeting the same end. And what's interesting about this phrase, what's interesting about this section is when the scriptures describe both of these people's death, they do so in very different ways. Lazarus is mentioned as being carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. And we'll discuss that here more in a second. But he's described as being carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. People have kind of extrapolated from that as to think about what the dying process might be like. I'm not going to comment on that right now. But then in stark contrast to that, you have the rich man who simply says he dies and he's buried. No fanfare, no angels, no bosom, no Abraham. He's died and he's buried. And so even though these two people have totally polar opposite type of lifestyles, they both connect at the one intersection called death. And then after this is when the story really starts to pick up, at least in my opinion. This is when Jesus is really making his point, because then he talks about the fact that these people go to two different places. This parable is unique in a lot of ways. Number one, for the fact that it describes, at least in my opinion, the most explicit description of the afterlife. And as with any parable, you don't want to take the parable and kind of pull things out of it that the parable really didn't describe. But there's two things that you can describe from this parable just as you see it right here. Number one, the rich man and Lazarus are in the afterlife while a life is still happening. That's why at the end of it, whenever the rich man is sitting in torment, he says, I want you to go up and I want you to send somebody to my Father's house so they can figure out what's going on, so they can stay away from this place. And so you have this kind of concurrent life where people in the afterlife are living at the same time, you can use that phrase very loosely, but are existing at least at the same time as people who are here on earth. But the second thing that it describes, at least in very vivid detail, is against the idea that some people would try to bring up today, which is annihilationism. And there are a lot of churches, there are a lot of people who call themselves Christians that preach that when you die and you're evil, instead of going to hell, you just simply cease to exist. That's annihilationism kind of in a nutshell. That you don't go to a place of torment, you don't go to hell, you die if you were bad, you just stop. Boom, you're done. But the rich man wished that was the case. Because as the rich man is sitting in torment, you can see and you can almost feel the emotion in his body as he is just in agony over the flame. And it talks about this perpetual kind of punishment that Jesus would elaborate further in describing things such as where the worm dieth not, the fire is not quenched. And so even though you don't want to pull too much out of this parable to describe the afterlife, you can very well, at least in my mind, deduce those two things. What you have is a description of these two different lifestyles. You have these two different places that are described, at least in my opinion, what we mentioned a second ago, in very, very vivid detail. And if you can imagine in your mind's eye what the rich man is going through at this point in time, he's sitting in torment. Nobody's around him, at least that we know about. And he's sitting in torment, and the flames are so intense that he asks Abraham, not just for water. That would be the logical thing. He doesn't ask for removal from the flame. That's what I would want to know. That's what I would want to happen. What he asks for is that Lazarus would go, which I think it's interesting that he asks Lazarus. Maybe that's because he could see him. But he asks for Lazarus to go and dip his finger in cool water and bring it to him so that his tongue can have just a minuscule amount of refreshment. If you haven't tried that, by the way, you should try it sometime. I actually went from my office back there and dipped my finger in the water to see what it would do. I'm sure most of you think that's kind of weird. But I dipped my finger in the water and put it on my tongue. People drove by and wondering what was going on. I put it on my tongue. It doesn't do anything. And yet this is the situation that the rich man is in. The rich man is in torment so much so that even the smallest drop of water that's carried from one place all the way to the next, that's what he's after. Not relief, but the smallest amount of relief. And notice the extremes that Jesus goes through in this parable. He doesn't just describe opulence, he describes the most lavish opulence. He doesn't just describe poverty, he describes dogs licking his sores. And then in this instance, he describes a finger being dipped inside water and carried all the way to him, put on side of his tongue. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Lazarus, who is mentioned as being within Abraham's bosom. Now, a lot of people think, well, that's kind of weird when you're describing Abraham's bosom, because literally what what that conjures up in your mind is that Lazarus is resting on top of Abraham. And I think that has a little to do with it. But if you remember in dinner parties back in the 1st century AD, you see this a little bit in the upper room scene when Jesus is there with his apostles in John chapters 13 through 16. What it describes is a very intimate type of dinner party. Because in those time periods, if you were dining, you would lean over on the couch, you would eat the food, you would kind of lay over, you would put it in your mouth, but it was very intimate. It's not in today's world where you sit in your chair, you have your fork, and you pass things down. You lean on couches, recline on couches. And it mentions specifically, I think it's in John the 14th chapter. Notice, by the way, that John always refers to himself in his gospel as the apostle whom Jesus loved. I think that's very interesting. But it describes in John the 14th chapter that he is leaning on Jesus' bosom. And I think you see a very similar type of idea here. Not necessarily that there's food, but that you have a very intimate type of communal setting by which Lazarus is sitting here with people like Abraham. Abraham's the one that's full view. But it's a very intimate, it's a very comfortable, it's a very cozy type of setting. And so you have these two diametrically opposed type of standpoints where literally you have Lazarus now on the opposite of the spectrum. He's the one that's in comfort. And the rich man cannot get a moment of relief. And what I want you to notice here, and I don't know if this was intentional, maybe I'm just pulling too much out of it, but notice how the extremes of them have completely switched. Whereas you have the rich man who is in such great opulence, now he's in such great poverty. Whereas Lazarus was in such great poverty, now he's in such great opulence, albeit speaking in a spiritual context. And so those two people have completely switched, their fortunes have completely switched, everything about them is backwards. Now I know what some people would say about this. When they describe the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, what they would say as they stop at this, and take a surface viewpoint of it, is they would say, well, the Bible in this passage, Luke chapter 16, does not mention anything about baptism. And so because Luke 16 doesn't mention anything about Lazarus getting baptized, that must mean that obviously baptism isn't that important. And people who do that, people who argue that, miss the point of that entirely. Because you know what Lazarus also never does? He never prays. He's never obedient. He never repents about anything. Literally, he's in one situation, and then he's in a different situation. And to my knowledge, you really don't even see Lazarus saying anything. And so the focus in Luke chapter 16, as it describes the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, is not what one needs to be saved, or do in order to be saved. But it describes the way in which we interact with each other. And that's really, when you look at what this parable is all about, that to me is what it is about. Look in Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 14. The context that immediately backs up this section. Look in Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 14. He says, now the Pharisees who were lovers of money were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your heart. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. If you're looking for, in my opinion, the key to unlocking Luke chapter 16, the story of the rich man and of Lazarus, there you have it. Because what he teaches immediately before he launches into this long parable is the simple description, the simple idea that what we esteem in this world is not always what God esteems. As we walk around in this world and as we try to make our way, quote unquote, in this world, we value things as humans, not necessarily me and Jeff, but we esteem things such as money. We esteem things such as glory. We want honor, we want power, we want physical strength. We want things, and maybe I'm just speaking as men, but we want things that make us better. And in reality, those things God doesn't care about at all. God does not care, I was about to say 1 penny. He does not care 1 cent, that's even better, what your bank account is. He doesn't care that Zach can run a 6-minute mile, which he can, I've seen him. I don't know if he can, but now he's on the hook, he has to. God doesn't care that you're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. God does not care about those things. But we do. We as humans instinctually do. We love those types of things. And so what this passage teaches in a little bit of a nutshell is that you can't focus your entire life's energies, everything about your being, on attaining things that will ultimately be destroyed. And yet we are. And so many times people would say, well, I don't have a problem with this, Brady, because I'm not rich. I don't even have a 401k. I don't have a job. I don't have anything. Let me tell you right now, there are people all across the socioeconomic scale that struggle with this exact issue. You do not have to be rich to fall under condemnation in Luke chapter 16. Because what James chapter 2 talks about is the pursuit of wealth, not wealth by itself. And that's a very important caveat that we need to put within this whole parable, because people would say, well, this doesn't apply to me because I don't have a gated property. It's not even remotely close. I wear purple. Obviously, I'm not the rich man. That's not what the parable teaches. Flip back a couple of pages. If you're in Luke chapter 16, go back to Luke chapter 12. Jesus preaches another parable that, in my opinion, leads right into what he talks about here in Luke chapter 16. In Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13, I love how people just look to Jesus to solve all their physical problems. Maybe that's hindsight from 2,000 years in the future looking back on it. But in Luke chapter 12 and verse 13, someone in the crowd cries out to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." What a petty type of argument. It's like me walking up to Paul and saying, "Well, Paul, why don't you solve the debate between who's better, the Texas Rangers and the Red Sox? You have a lot of stuff going on in your life. But this really matters to me." By the way, he chose the Red Sox. That's how petty this conversation seems to begin. But look at verse 14. He says to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" Verse 15, then he said to them, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed." Every form of greed. "For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions." Focus in on that word. Or focus in on that phrase. Because we think for whatever reason that things are going to make us happy. That stuff is going to make us happy. That money is going to make us happy. We've always said the phrase, "Well, once I get this, then my life's complete." Or once I go on that vacation, that's when everything will become better. And what he says, quite frankly, here in Luke the 12th chapter and verse 15 is, not even when you have an abundance does your life really consist of those possessions. That's not what your life is all about. It's the farthest thing from it. Verse 16, he told him a parable saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' And then he said to him," verse 18, said to himself, "This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods." Notice his intention to build the things. And then in verse 18, or verse 19, then he starts talking to himself. "I will say to my soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Verse 20, "But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man," verse 21, "who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God.'" Did you notice the problem with this person in this situation? The problem with this person is not the fact that he hasn't... the problem with this person, if I can get these P's right, the problem with this person is not that he has possessions. That's not the problem. The problem with this person is that his possessions do not amount to what matters in this life. He hasn't taken care of the spiritual alongside of the physical. And we sometimes will spend 40, 50, 60, 70 years preparing for that day of retirement, and not one Sunday preparing our soul. And that was the problem that the Pharisees, there's another P word, that's the problem that the Pharisees had in this situation. Is that they spent so much time talking about all the things that they had and all the trips that they would go on, the clothes and the respect that they garnered on people. They didn't care one bit about their relationship with God. Notice what he said at the beginning of this parable, Luke chapter 12, that not even in your abundance does your life consist of possessions. That's not what defines you. By the time you get to Luke chapter 16, you start talking about the rich man, that's absolutely what defines him. We know nothing else about this person besides the fact that he was rich. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a problem. If your wealth, if your hobbies or your goals or whatever is physical is what defines you, then that's the problem. I think as we look at the rich man, we can derive a few very important lessons from this person. I think number one, the first thing that we can derive from this rich man is that self-justification can quite frankly just be an illusion. We all have an opinion about ourselves. We all have a status or a viewpoint that we have about ourselves, and some of it may be rooted in truth, and some of it could not be more off if we tried. There was an experiment done in 1970 at Stanford University at the seminary that was on, actually I think it was Princeton University, the seminary that was on campus there. And what they did was they took 50 seminary students, and they put them in one room, and they said, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to prepare a teaching." These were seminary students who should have known this. "I want you to prepare a short 5 to 10 minute talk on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I want you to go to the building over there, and I want you to deliver them." And he sequestered them out. He said, some of them, he put them in a huge hurry. "I want you to go there now, they're waiting for you." Some of them he said, "You can take a couple minutes if you want to." Other people said, "They're there, but there's not really anybody there, so you can take your time." So there's 3 different speeds. And all 3 of those different groups of students went off towards the second building to prepare a story or a teaching on the parable of the Good Samaritan. But what they did was, instead of making the parable of the Good Samaritan teaching the main objective, was they placed a homeless man on the path between building 1 and building 2. And all three of those groups of people went right past them. All three of them had to go right by that homeless man in order to get to that building. And that homeless man every single time asked out, will you help me with something? Will you help me with money? Will you help me with your time? Will you help me tie my shoe? Whatever the situation was. And what they noticed categorically was that 50% of the people that were more in a hurry didn't stop to help. The people that weren't in any kind of hurry, the people that were just kind of taking their time, no problem. I think 60, 70% of those people stopped to take care of the immediate need that they saw in front of them. By contrast, only 20% of the people that were in a hurry, that needed to be there right now, even remotely stopped to help. And what does that teach us? What that teaches us is sometimes we can become so consumed with our own life. We can become so consumed with what we see that we need to take care of this now, that we need to take care of that. We need to do all these different things that we never stop to look at the needs around us. We become so consumed with our own lives that we never consider, as we talk about in 1 Peter chapter 4, that we never consider what we can do to help others. The other thing that these people noticed was that it wasn't about contempt. It wasn't that they looked down on these people necessarily. But that over time, as you become more and more self-absorbed and more busy, your cognitive thinking begins to narrow. And you begin to miss details, not only in your own life, but also in other people's lives. And you see this in the story of the rich man Lazarus in spades. Because this was a person who was so consumed with his own life that he literally had to step right over Lazarus or around him and never once stopped to think about him. Never once cared about him. In James chapter 1, starting in verse 26 rather. Notice what James has to say right here. James chapter 1, starting in verse 26. He says, if anyone thinks himself to be religious, and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. I'm not going to do it, but if I ask a show of hands, of who here thinks that they're religious, I would imagine everybody but Joe's hand would go straight up in the air. We all think that we're religious. That's what he mentions at the end of that. But deceives his own heart, yet does not bridle his tongue. Deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God our Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. What he mentions very specifically here is that if you think that you're something, if you think that because you lead singing, John, that you're religious, you don't bridle your own tongue. You are deceiving yourself as to your own religious standing before God. But notice what he mentions also here in verse 9. The brother of humble circumstances. Chapter 1 and verse 9. The brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. That last phrase there at the end of verse 11 is paramount to understanding this section. Because if you blink, you miss what he said there in verses 9 and 10. Go back and look at verses 9 and 10. When he says there in verse 9, the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position. You notice what he says there? He doesn't say the brother of great means is to glory in his high position. He says the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position. In other words, those who don't have a lot, those who don't have a whole lot of things in this world they can count on, those who kind of are like the Lazarus, are just kind of there, glory in their high position. And yet the rich man is to glory in his lower position. And what this is not doing is not talking about if you're evil, you're rich, and if you're poor, you're great. That's not what he's discussing. What he's discussing is what he mentions there in verse 11, how all of those things will eventually vanish away. And what he's addressing there in James chapter 1, and what I think he picks up there at the end of verses 24 and 25, is that what you do in this world doesn't matter. Where you are financially in this world does not matter before God. And yet sometimes we take a lot of pride in that type of stuff. What does matter is how we handle other people. What does matter is how we treat other people. Are we doing things for other people? Are we doing things for other people with what we have? Because all of us on some level can say, well, not rich, so I can't do a whole lot. It doesn't matter. Are you doing what you can with what you have to do what you have to do? That was the most interesting thing about the book of Job. If you look at Job chapter 42, go all the way back to the Old Testament. If you look at what is said about Job, Job 42, all the way at the end of this. Actually, it's not even said about Job at all. But if you look at Job chapter 42, starting in verse 7. It said it came about after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord had said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, because you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore, take for yourself 7 bulls, 7 rams, go to my servant Job, offer up a burnt offering for yourselves, and my servant Job will pray for you. Most of us are familiar with the story of Job. And what we recognize from the story of Job is that for 42 straight chapters, or 38, or whatever it is, the bulk of it, the friends are lambasting Job for what he's done wrong. Over and over again, Job, you've sinned. You had to have sinned. Job, you've sinned. You had to have sinned. I know this because I'm Eliphaz. And what you find out by the time you get to the end of that is Eliphaz's own opinion of himself doesn't really work much. The other friends and their opinion of themselves, their opinions of other people, it's not really worth a whole lot. Because they haven't adequately judged their own standing before God first. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, we can look so high up on ourselves and think so much about ourselves that not only are we wrong about ourselves, but we're inaccurate about other people as well. All of us have been in this position before. We see somebody that's asking for money on the side of the road. We're pulling somewhere, we see somebody that's asking for money, and immediately what we think of is the exact same thing all of us think of. They're there because they deserve to be there. And none of us act like the rich man. None of us would say, I'm the rich man because of X, Y, and Z. But whenever we think that, it doesn't any better. Why did the rich man not give him any crumbs? Why did the rich man not help him out at all? Was it because he had an exalted opinion about himself and he lowered him? Never forget that in John the 9th chapter, when Jesus is walking by with his apostles with the blind man, the apostles just take for granted for the fact that they ask the question, who sinned, this person or his parents? Somebody had to have sinned. Notice how they just take that for granted. Sometimes our opinion of ourselves, opinion of other people can quite frankly just be wrong. Also notice this about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. If we live alone, we will die alone. This is one of the things that I hate, and we mentioned this during Bible class, and one of the things that just drives me nuts is when people make the claim that they can have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Now I know what they mean when they say that. But it doesn't make sense on a functional level. You know why? Because the way that we interact with other people impacts our relationship with Christ. And that's the truth of the matter. Whenever the rich man was walking by Lazarus over and over again, whether he walked around him, whether he walked over him, he always had to pass right by him. But did you notice that Lazarus has a name? Most likely because he was forgotten in this world. Lazarus has a name. His name is Lazarus. No, he was most likely forgotten. The rich man doesn't have a name. Do you ever notice that? Lazarus is one of the only people in any parable that actually has a name. The rich man does not have a name. Because quite frankly, he could be like any one of us. As we mentioned earlier, somebody would say, well, this doesn't apply to me. I can't be the rich man because I don't have a gate on my house. I don't dress in purple. I'm not rich, so it doesn't matter to me. Never forget the fact that if you live in this country, you hit the genetic jackpot, ladies and gentlemen. The global income statistics, I'll bore you with a little statistics for just a second. If you're high income in this global world, that means that you live on more than $50 a day. And you would think, well, $50 a day, that's like 10 Starbucks. Maybe 7, depending on which kind you get. $50 a day, that's high income. 7% of the world population lives on that kind of income level. I'm sorry, that kind of consumption level. 56% of Americans do. On the other end of the spectrum, low income is judged as being right about $2 or less a day. 15% of the world population lives or consumes at about that level. 15% of them. Only 2% of Americans do. And so before you get on your high horse, and I'm not thinking of anyone in specific, I know I gave Joe and John a hard time, but before you think that you're above this idea of the rich man, because in comparative culture, you're middle to low income, or whatever the situation is, never forget the fact that if you live in this country, you get the genetic jackpot. And it is our duty to do to other people what we know that Christ has done for us, by helping them, by being sacrificial, by being selfless. Never forget the fact that as you look at the story of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man is not described as doing anything wrong. Did you notice that? That throughout the story of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man never is charged with murder. He's never charged with adultery. He's never charged with theft. The only wrong thing that he ever did was he never paid any attention to Lazarus. If you look at the Old Testament, or Deuteronomy chapter 15, you'll see exactly how God judges this. Deuteronomy chapter 15, starting in verse 7. He says, if there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him, shall generously lend him sufficient for his need. That's the key phrase, the need, in whatever he lacks. Beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of remission, is near, and your eye is hostile towards your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry out to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin to you. For sin you shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. Verse 11, for the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy, and to the poor that are in your land. Our responsibility, ladies and gentlemen, is to take care of those around us. Now we have to, and I mean this with the absolute most certainty, we have to be good stewards of what we have. We have to use good judgment in evaluating situations. But as he mentions here in Deuteronomy chapter 15, we cannot have an eye of evil towards our brother. We cannot have an eye of hatred or spite or condescension towards our brother, no matter what the need. The ones that are obvious and the ones that aren't obvious. In Luke the 16th chapter, verses 10 through 13, right before he launches into this big discussion about the rich man and Lazarus, notice how he finishes up the parable right before that. In Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 10. Notice how he finishes up the parable right before he launches into this one. He starts talking about the unrighteous steward, which is my second favorite parable, in case anyone was wondering. Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 10. This is the summation of that parable, or this is the lesson from that parable. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. He who is in unrighteousness, a very little thing, is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, verse 11, if you have not been faithful in the eye of unrighteous, well, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. This probably isn't a secret at all in regards to money, but let me dispel a myth about money. Not everything that we've been given in this world is used solely for our own personal enjoyment. In large measure, the things that we've been given in this world is in part how we handle other people, and how we help other people. And as he mentions here in verses 10 down through verse 12, if we're not righteous in these things, how can we be compared to measure in spiritual things? So one of the reasons why, in my opinion, both elders and deacons in 1 Timothy chapter 3 are described as being stewards. How can you manage the household of God if you can't even manage your own household? If we can't manage this, how can we be entrusted with those things? Stewardship of our items, stewardship of our things is important. We can't have an eye of evil towards our brother. Let me also say this, and this will be the last thing I say. Death is final. I was reading this parable a few years ago and it hit me like a sack of bricks. I almost passed out, literally, just right over here actually, as a matter of fact. Nathan wasn't here, but if he had, he would have laughed at me. But as I was looking at this parable, I remember thinking to myself, as I was reading it, I was thinking, you learn, this is the thought that came to me, you learn more about your life in the first 15 seconds after your death. Most people ever know in their lifetime. In the first 15 seconds after you die, you realize, I'm using it very colloquially, but you realize how powerful God is. You realize how necessary obedience was. You recognize how important your heart is. You recognize that there's a hell and a heaven, despite people in this world that will try to teach you differently. But we realize things in those first 15 seconds that we would love to go back in time and fix at that moment. And that's what the story of the rich man and Lazarus tells us, at least in a nutshell. That rich man would give anything to go back to his life and fix it, because once he realized that he was in torments, he knew there was no way to get out. It's not as if he asked, like Catholics would say, why don't you pray for me, or why don't you give money, because that's what I need to get out of this. He knew that his situation was final. I bet you he had realized that beforehand. That he'd go back in time and fix the things that he knew were lacking in his life. Take care of those things now. And that's ultimately what he needed to do. As you look at Luke chapter 16 and you look at verse 27, notice the urgency in his voice. In Luke chapter 16, notice the urgency in his voice in verse 27. He says, I beg you, Father, you send him to my father's house. I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, they will not also come to this place of torment. Abraham said they can. Most of the prophets, let them hear them. Verse 30, no, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. Verse 31, he said to them, they don't have listened to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded even if someone rises from the dead. You know what the rich man realized as soon as he was dead? The necessity of obeying God. The And there will be a lot of people on Judgment Day who may have never thought about that or never considered it as much as they should. That will become glaringly obvious on that day of judgment, how important it was for them to follow him. The rich man knew his time was up. It wasn't a question of whether or not he'd go back in time and undo things. As you look at this in Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 16, look several verses previous to what we just read. As you look in Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 16, it says, the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. And since that time, the gospel of the kingdom has been preached, and everyone's forcing his way into it. But it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter of the law to fail. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. He who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. There have been a lot of people who have speculated not just about why this section is in there, verses 17, but also why is verse 18 in there. Why in verse 17 does Jesus, in the middle of this discussion about stewardship and about God and about eternity, why does he stick a marriage covenant in there? That's because the people that he's addressing, at least in my opinion, in Luke chapter 16, were people who were so anti-God that to them the law wasn't about what it actually said. It's about how they could profit from it. People that weren't stewards of their positions in life. People that weren't stewards of their marriage situation. People that weren't stewards of anything. Just in there for themselves. And how much they could gain for themselves. One of the things we realize as soon as this life is over is that that death that we experience is final. And if you look at Genesis, the 19th chapter, we won't go back in time to read it, but if you look at Genesis chapter 19 and you see the discussion that Abraham has, or Lot has with his sons-in-law, as he tells them that Sodom and Gomorrah is about to be destroyed and you need to get out now. The response from his son-in-laws is that he's joking about it. And because of that, they paid with their lives. Is that your response? Is that your goal? I don't read it very much, but I do like the story Christmas Carol. I don't know if anybody else does. It's a weird story for me, so I don't read it because it's creepy. But if you're familiar with the story of the Christmas Carol, what you know is that the whole story is centered around a really awful, lame guy named Ebenezer Scrooge. He doesn't want anybody having fun. He doesn't want Tiny Tim to take a day off of work so he can spend time with his family. He just wants to pinch his pennies and keep them inside his pocket. That's what the whole story is about. And he's visited by Christmas past, he's visited by Christmas present, Christmas future. And all these ghosts are there to try and right the ship, try and get his mind right. We sometimes forget about that stories before all of those ghosts of Christmas whatever show up. It's his old business partner shows up. Jacob Mallory, if I have that name right. And Jacob Mallory shows up. Jacob Marley's brother. Jacob Marley shows up. And he's talking to Ebenezer Scrooge. And he has chains on. He has chains over his wrist. Ebenezer Scrooge looks at him and he says, "Why do you have chains on?" This is what Jacob Marley says. He says, "I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link, yard by yard. I girded it on my own free will, and on my own free will I wore it. Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil that you bear yourself? It was as full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since." And then when he says to Ebenezer Scrooge, finally, before he departs, he says, "I'm here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance of hope in escaping of my fate. A chance and a hope of my procuring Ebenezer." Ultimately, the story of the rich man and Lazarus is kind of a depressing tale. Because the focus is not on Lazarus. If the focus were on Lazarus, about how he's with Abraham's bosom and he's a loving wife, that'd be great. And I think we need to put focus on that. But the attention is squarely on the rich man. What he did wrong and how he ignored Lazarus for his entire existence, more or less. So not only do we have the story of hope, we also have the story of warning. And what he's granted us in the 16th chapter is a peek behind the curtain to see truly what matters in this life. And what truly matters in this life is not status, it's not power, it's not glory, it's not money. It's whether or not, number one, we love God. Number two, whether we love each other. And a love that is action-based. A love that produces things. And a love that is obedient. What's your situation like this morning? Are you one of those people who thinks about everything else before they think about God, and you want to make sure that your 401k is taken care of, and your job promotion is lined up, and then your car is parked in the right spot, because all those things are so important? Or am I somebody who looks towards other people first, and how I can use the things that I've been blessed with in this world to help other people? Whether or not I can use my body for God's glory instead of my own. Regardless of your situation here this morning, if you need the prayers of this congregation, we can help you with that. All we ask is that you come forward and stand.